Welcome, one and all. I'm Jean Tiberio, and I'm a nutritionist and a wellness coach. Welcome to Healing Outside the Box. This is episode 220, and I'm calling it, Where Did Monsanto Go? Long story short, the corporation Bayer bought Monsanto because apparently all of those geniuses thought they could just hide under a different rock or name and everything would be just ducky. And I will get to that. But first, I want to tell you about the lovely moment I just had outside my house on the Salem Common. I was wheeling around the common in my wheelchair, and I stopped to take in the warmth of a bright summer day. I looked up at a beautiful, very old oak tree, and I was overcome with emotion. It's funny I don't get that feeling when I look at an artist's take on nature. Just the real thing, I guess. When I was out there staring at the tree, I was reminded of a poem by Joyce Kilmer, and it's called Trees. I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree whose hungry mouth is pressed against the sweet earth's flowing breast, a tree that looks at God all day and lifts her leafy arms to pray, a tree that may in summer wear a nest of robins in her hair, upon whose bosom snow has lain, who intimately lives with rain. Poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. So there you have it. That's Trees by Joyce Kilmer. I don't mean to make fun of Kilmer's poem, yet her point, I think, she doth brought home. Anyway, I had a lovely time sitting on the Salem Common in the sunshine on a warm summer day, looking at the rays of sunshine fluttering through the leaves. But alas, I have a podcast episode to put on. This week, I'm going to get you up to date on what's happening with the Roundup herbicide and Bayer. Just for some background, in case you're not as obsessed with Roundup as I am, the Bayer Corporation purchased Monsanto after Trump had been in office a few months, which makes Roundup in all the cases surrounding Roundup now under the name of Bayer. And there now are over 10,000 civil cases that are pending against Bayer. Here's the latest on the Roundup cases that are again now under the warm and fuzzy name of Bayer. By the way, if you Google Bayer, and I Googled Bayer and paused, what comes up in the drop-down menu is a bunch of articles connecting Bayer to the Holocaust, and more specifically, the manufacture of Zyklon B. So I hesitate to think that Bayer deserves the warm and fuzzy description. But let's move on to Roundup. People who spray Roundup for a living are getting non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, the most famous being a guy by the name of Dwayne Johnson. There was a class action lawsuit, and they were awarded a total of $2 billion by a jury. Then only days ago, a judge adjusted the verdict down about 90% to slightly less than $100 million. That's still some good walking around money. So this is all to say that the verdict is no longer out. Roundup causes cancer in farm workers and groundspeople who are employed spraying this weed killer on school grounds. Let's go back and repeat what I just said. People are spraying Roundup on school grounds where children play. And speaking of children, here's another study published by the National Institutes of Health. And they are not by nature crazy tree huggers. The article is called The Evidence of Human Exposure to Glyphosate, a Review. So these people tested urine in farm workers, but they also tested urine in the children of these farm workers. I'll give you a link to the NIH publication in the show notes, but right here I'll just summarize for you. This study that involved 2 separate states examined urinary glyphosate concentrations in both farmers, their wives, and their children. By the way, glyphosate is not supposed to be in anybody's urine in any concentration. Just FYI. They tested the urine the day before the spraying, the day of the spraying, and 3 days after the crop was sprayed with Roundup. They found that 60% of the farmers and 12% of the children had toxic levels of glyphosate in their urine. And I think we can all guess that what that means is that when Roundup is sprayed on school grounds, all of the school children playing outside are exposed to Roundup because it does become an aerosol. So how did we get here? The easy answer is perhaps by not paying attention because we have so much going on in our lives from day to day. So let's first go back and take a history lesson on how all of this came about. Monsanto started selling Roundup in 1974. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup, and it kills plants in a similar way to antibiotics killing bacteria. It works by inhibiting a biochemical pathway that plants need to grow. And the specific enzyme that plants need is called EPSP synthase. Now, you don't need to know that enzyme. Just know that animals don't share that pathway, which is temporarily reassuring. So for 20 years, this spraying went on and it did not attract much attention. But don't get too relaxed. Here come the GMOs. In 1996, Monsanto started selling genetically modified crops, or GMOs. They were genetically modified so that they could tolerate glyphosate. In other words, glyphosate kills all plants, and corn is a plant. So at that time, you could buy genetically modified corn, soybeans, and a few other things that are immune to glyphosate. In other words, Monsanto started selling seeds that were glyphosate tolerant. These GMO plants produce an enzyme that performs the same function as that EPSP synthase, but is not killed by the glyphosate. Again, humans don't have this synthase enzyme, so glyphosate won't immediately kill us. So far, so good. On paper, anyway. Since that time, weeds eventually became resistant to Roundup. But let's give scientists the benefit of the doubt and say that they didn't know that at the time. This meant that farmers could now spray this chemical right over the Roundup-ready corn or soybeans, or cotton, or alfalfa, or, well, now anything, and the crops would be fine, but the weeds would die. Monsanto quickly became the world's biggest seed company, and farmers started spraying a lot more Roundup. Sales of the Roundup increased tenfold. Glyphosate was then used for things like destroying cocaine and poppy crops in Colombia. It all sounds pretty good so far. And this all happened so fast that it started scaring a lot of scientists. And then farmers started to be skeptical when the weeds were becoming tolerant as well. And pretty soon, Monsanto, being the company that it is, or was, started suing farmers that didn't buy their exclusive seeds each and every year. They were suing farmers all over the U.S., then they were suing Canadian farmers, then they sued the entire country of India, forcing India to buy their increasingly expensive rice seeds every year, when poor Indian farmers weren't accustomed to doing so. Then there were anti-GMO protests all around the world, and glyphosate came under increasing scrutiny. It was only then that the studies really began looking at the toxicity factor in Roundup. Since that time, Monsanto started doubling down and sued the state of Vermont when Vermont voters overwhelmingly passed a GMO labeling law. And guess what? Monsanto won. Monsanto won over Vermont voters' right to choose. And there's probably many more horrific stories that I don't have time to get into, but you get the picture. On March 20th, 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization, decided to carry out an assessment of Roundup risk. This agency, announced its conclusion on that date. Quote, glyphosate is probably carcinogenic to humans. End quote. That conclusion rested on many studies. This agency found strong evidence that glyphosate can damage DNA in cells. This kind of damage, inducing mutations, is the first step in causing cancer. They also found that in mice that ate glyphosate, there were all kinds of tumors, a lot of liver and kidney tumors, which tells me it's going through their whole system. Kate Guyton, a senior toxicologist at this agency, told reporters at a news conference that, quote, these two studies give sufficient evidence of cancer in animals, end quote. Now, this Guyton woman has been studying the causes of cancer for decades, so she knows about this business. She stated, quote, nothing I have ever done provoked as much of a reaction as the glyphosate announcement. The internet kind of exploded, end quote. Then the civil lawsuits began. There were 3 civil trials in or near San Francisco, which I found interesting because San Francisco is not in the Farm Belt. After Dwayne Johnson, the guy who got cancer after spraying schoolyards with Roundup, won his civil court case, there was an avalanche of civil cases, resulting in the most recent class action lawsuit for $2 billion. That was reduced a few days ago. During that trial, this guy Miller and his legal team showed the jurors a whole collection of internal Monsanto emails. And we know how much fun it is to read emails that no one thinks the public is going to see. In one email, company executives described phone calls with an official at the EPA. The official said, I don't need to see any more studies. I'm going to declare Roundup safe, and I'm going to stop the EPA from looking into it. Another Monsanto executive discussed ghostwriting papers on glyphosate safety that scientists could then publish under their own names. Oh, no, you didn't, Monsanto. So, Monsanto, aka Bayer, definitely has something to hide. But will Roundup kill everyone who comes in contact with it? No, it will not. And there is a lot of conflicting information out there, for sure. It is not violently toxic to people in small doses. But if you get it on your skin or happen to ingest just a little bit of it, you probably will get sick. Just a little bit too much like household bleach. Now, since then, more studies in rodents, i.e. rats and mice, have found that glyphosate can damage the liver and kidneys, even for doses in the range generally considered safe for humans. So now they're testing lower doses. Young pigs that were fed soybeans contaminated with glyphosate have exhibited congenital malformations, not unlike birth defects in people. And those birth defects in people are now found in alarming rates in farmers and their children. This guy, Michael Skinner of Washington State University, tested rats that were fed glyphosate in small doses. He found that in some cases, the malign effects of treatment did not show up in the organism eating the glyphosate, or in some cases even the offspring, but in the next 2 generations of offspring. In other words, these grandbaby rats showed high rates of multiple diseases, such as prostate disease, ovarian disease, kidney disease, and other birth defects. By the way, I got that information from a Bloomberg article, and I'll give you a link to it in the show notes. Now there is a new incident brewing that is just hot off the presses 2 days ago. Bayer is now in trouble because it adopted glyphosate and ran with a ball that says, the best defense is perhaps a good offense theory. They apparently developed an enemies list, and a French newspaper caught up with them. This French newspaper called Le Monde discovered that prosecutors in Paris were investigating a list developed by Bayer to respond to the crisis over Roundup. The list was created as part of a PR initiative to support glyphosate. This list included the names of more than 200 people, including journalists, politicians, agricultural experts, and nonprofit leaders, and categorized this list by their negative position on glyphosate. And the French went after them because the French law tightly regulates the creation of these enemy lists or databases of people based on their political views. Okay, let's round up this podcast episode with this. Here is what my gut is telling me about the use of Roundup on food. If the manufacturers of Roundup and other herbicides/pesticides used it sparingly, I'm not sure that there would be much of a problem. But there is, because it is now being sprayed generously on everything, including the wheat just before harvesting. Roundup is now being sprayed on at least 70% of the food that is consumed in this country. And the food has been tested, and sure enough, about 70% of the food is testing positive for Roundup. In other words, the food just before you put it into your mouth. That's not just the produce. That's cereal, cookies, even baby food. And my gut also tells me that there is a cumulative effect with other herbicides or preservatives that can be damaging to our gut in changing our healthy gut bacteria. Recent studies have also found glyphosate and similar herbicides in our drinking water and groundwater. Add to this that scientists now know that there are adverse consequences for our environment. In other words, you sterilize the soil and you kill earthworms and healthy bacteria that make healthy plants. And now we have indications, as I've mentioned, that this glyphosate can cause disease in farm animals and people even several generations after the initial exposure. That information tells me that the onslaught of all sorts of these chemicals in our food can cause damage or partial damage to our DNA. And this brings on, among other things, cancer. What can we do? Well, I'm so glad you asked. As much as our budget will allow, I think we should buy organic. If you want to make a priority list, the most important foods to buy organic are your produce and your chicken and other meats. So, as the poet in me likes to say, if we really want Roundup to go, with our shopping carts, we make it so. That's all I have for you today. Be well and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.